What would make an ordinary person interrupt a billion-dollar negotiation with such precision? In an ordinary cafe, a contract about to be signed receives a subtle and unsettling question. That sentence carries far more than curiosity. It's an old wound that refuses to heal. And the revelation that follows exposes truths that even power couldn't hide. If this story interested you, subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Let's begin. Canary Wharf in London pulses like a vital artery of British capitalism. A river of well-tailored suits, armored cars, and stratospheric ambitions flows incessantly, indifferent to everything that doesn't translate into figures, charts, and power. The air vibrates with the urgency of business, and every wasted second is a minor heresy. In this ecosystem of corporate predators and prey, delicacy is a weakness, and attention to detail a luxury few can afford. Amidst this whirlwind, nestled among mirrored skyscrapers that scrape an almost always grey sky, the Aurora Café was an anomaly, a small refuge of mahogany and freshly ground beans, where time for a few moments seemed to ask for leave. And it was there, behind the polished marble counter, that Eli Foster observed the world. To the hurried executives who barely looked up from their smartphones to order a double espresso, he was just part of the furniture. A young man with a serene expression, newly hired as a cashier, whose movements were as discreet as the gentle aroma of coffee that hung in the air. No one imagined that, beneath the calm demeanor and impeccable uniform, there existed a mind that operated with the precision of a chess grandmaster, analyzing every move, every nuance, every veiled intention on the grand chessboard of life unfolding before him. That Tuesday had dawned with a fine, persistent drizzle, enveloping the city in a melancholic mist. The movement in the cafe was weaker than usual, allowing silence to settle in an almost solemn manner, broken only by the hiss of the coffee machine and the turning of newspaper pages. It was in this calm setting that a particular customer captured Eli's attention. Seated at a window table, with the upright posture of someone accustomed to commanding, a man was leafing through a hefty stack of papers that seemed too heavy to be just a contract. It was Henry Vance, the name behind Vance Enterprises, a titan of the real estate market whose decisions shaped the city's skyline. Henry wasn't there for a casual coffee. He was awaiting the arrival of a representative from an international investment fund to seal an agreement that would redefine the future of his company. A transaction of over £1 billion, one of those that either catapult a company into the stratosphere or drag it into the abyss. Eli, as he cleaned a nearby table with the silent efficiency that had become his trademark, felt the tension in the air. It was a subtle energy, almost imperceptible to most, but to him it was as palpable as the warmth emanating from the freshly served cup. His attentive eyes saw not just a CEO, but a man on the threshold of a monumental decision. He saw the weight of responsibility on Henry's broad shoulders, the way his fingers drummed nervously on the table, betraying his facade of absolute control. The cafe door opened, and a man with foreign features, carrying a leather briefcase that seemed to contain the secrets of the universe, entered and headed directly to Henry's table. The exchange of greetings was brief, professional, and soon the two figures leaned over the contract, delving into a dialogue of technical terms that sounded like an arcane language to the few present. For Eli, however, those words were like a painful echo of a past he struggled to overcome. Compensation for currency fluctuation, contractual review clause in the second year, redistribution of net losses. Each term was a knife stirring an old wound. Years before, he wasn't the cashier of a cafe in Canary Wharf. He was a young entrepreneur, full of dreams, owner of a small artisanal candle and cosmetics company, a business built with his own hands, with the help of his grandmother, who had taught him the secrets of essences and oils. The business grew, and with growth came the need for expansion. That's when he, naive and poorly advised, signed an investment contract, a contract that contained clauses with language frighteningly familiar to what he was hearing now. He lost everything. The company, his savings, his self-confidence. The fall was brutal, and the most humiliating part was not understanding exactly how it had happened, how the ink on paper had turned into his ruin. It was this pain that spurred him on. Instead of drowning in bitterness, Eli decided to understand the weapon that had destroyed him. He delved into a universe that was completely alien to him. Between shifts at odd jobs to pay the bills, He devoured books on corporate law, accounting handouts downloaded from the internet, watched hours of video lessons on finance. The public library became his second home, and corporate jargon once indecipherable began to make sense. He rebuilt his knowledge brick by brick, not for revenge but to never again be the prey. Now there at the Aurora Cafe, past and present collided vertiginously. He saw in Henry Vance a reflection of himself years ago, a man about to fall into the same trap on an infinitely larger scale. The dilemma consumed him. Who was he to intervene? A mere cashier. His interference would be at best ignored, at worst ridiculed, costing him the job he so desperately needed to get back on his feet. Keeping silent was the safest, most logical path, but the image of his own company crumbling, his grandmother's look of disappointment, the overwhelming feeling of failure, he couldn't allow that to happen to someone else, right before his eyes. The price of silence, he knew, was too high. Life had taught him the hard way that omission is also a choice, and its consequences can be as devastating as a miscalculated action. He watched the two men for another moment. The International Fund representative pointed to a line in the document, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Henry nodded, looking convinced, ready to pick up the pen. It was at that moment that Eli knew what he had to do. The decision crystallized in his mind, firm and irrevocable. He took a deep breath, feeling his heart race in his chest. It wasn't about heroism, nor about seeking recognition. It was about honoring his own story, about transforming his greatest pain into an act of protection. With the tray in his hand, and an expression of serenity that belied the storm within him, he walked towards the table by the window. Each step was a battle against doubt and fear. He didn't have an elaborate plan, just the conviction that he needed to spark a doubt in that CEO's mind. A small pause that could change everything. As he approached, he cleared his throat discreetly. "Gentlemen, excuse me. Would you like another coffee?" The question was trivial, a pretext. Henry Vance looked up, impatience visible on his face. "No, thank you. We're busy," he said with the sharp voice of someone who tolerates no interruptions. But Eli didn't back down. His eyes met Henry's, and for a fraction of a second he allowed his urgency to show. "Forgive my intrusion, Mr. Vance," Eli began, his voice low but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear the mention of the loss redistribution clause. Just out of curiosity, does it differ at any point from the electronic version that was discussed last week?" The question was like a stone cast into a calm lake. The foreign executive frowned, surprised by the audacity. Henry, in turn, remained silent, incredulity etched on his face. How could a simple cafe employee know about the details of such a negotiation? The seed of doubt had been planted. Henry, who had built his empire on distrust and meticulous attention to detail, couldn't simply ignore that. Eli's intervention, however bizarre and improbable, had broken the hypnotic flow of the negotiation. The young cashier didn't just ask the question, he subtly tilted his head towards a small note he had made on a napkin, which he had discreetly left on the edge of the table while cleaning. It was just a paragraph number and 2 words: "Third year." Henry, initially annoyed by the interruption, felt a chill run down his spine. Something in the firmness of the young man's gaze, in the specificity of his question, triggered an internal alarm. He was a man who trusted his instincts, and his instincts screamed that something was wrong. "What are you talking about?" Henry asked, his voice now laden with cautious curiosity, irritation giving way to intrigue. The fund representative smiled, a gesture intended to be reassuring but which seemed forced. "It's just a standard adjustment, Henry. Semantics, let's not waste time on it." But it was too late. Eli had created the necessary fissure. "If you'll permit me, sir," Eli said, still in the same respectful tone, "sometimes semantics can alter a company's destiny, especially when it comes to risks transferred in a asymmetrical way." The word asymmetrical hung in the air, laden with meaning. It wasn't a word one would expect to hear from a cafe cashier. Henry picked up the printed contract and, ignoring the veiled protests of his interlocutor, quickly leafed through to the mentioned section. His eyes scanned the lines, then stopped. He reread the clause once, twice, 3 times. The blood drained from his face. The change was subtle, almost poetic in its malice. A single sentence, altered from the digital draft his lawyers had approved, changed everything. What seemed like a technical adjustment concealed a devastating legal trap that, from the third year of the contract, transferred all operational and exchange rate risks to Vance Enterprises, completely shielding the investors from any loss. It was a masterstroke, camouflaged in corporate jargon, a ticking time bomb planted in the heart of the billion-pound deal. Henry slowly raised his head, his eyes fixed on Eli. That young man with his simple uniform and humble demeanor had just saved his company from a disaster of cataclysmic proportions. The meeting was abruptly terminated. Henry, with cutting coldness, informed the representative that the agreement was suspended for an in-depth legal review. The foreign executive tried to argue, but the expression on Henry's face left no room for discussion. He left the cafe with the haste of someone unmasked. In the silence that followed, Henry continued to stare at Eli, a mixture of astonishment, gratitude, and profound curiosity. "Who are you?" he asked, the question echoing in the emptiness of the cafe. Eli merely gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Just the cashier, sir. Eli Foster." He collected the tray and, with the same discretion as before, returned behind the counter as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. That day in the financial heart of Britain, an improbable chess match had been played, and the checkmate didn't come from a rival CEO or a brilliant lawyer, but from a young man who, between one espresso and another, read the world with a clarity that money couldn't buy. Eli's gesture, however, had not gone entirely unnoticed. At a more distant table, a man who had spent the entire morning furiously typing on a laptop, pretending not to pay attention to anything, looked up. He was a journalist for a business blog, known for his appetite for scoops and sensational headlines. He hadn't understood the technical details of the conversation, but he had grasped the essential. The cafe cashier had said something that made the great Henry Vance suspend a billion-pound deal. He smelled a story, one of those stories that could go viral. He smiled to himself, closed his laptop, and discreetly left the cafe. The name Eli Foster already noted on his phone. The next day began like any other at the Aurora Cafe, but Eli's absence was a dissonant note in the morning symphony. Henry Vance, who had returned to the cafe hoping to speak with the young man, was informed by the manager that Eli had called earlier and resigned, citing urgent personal reasons. The news dropped like a bomb for Henry. He couldn't understand. The young man had done something extraordinary, and instead of waiting for a reward, for recognition, he had simply disappeared. Henry's intrigue turned into an obsession. He needed to find Eli, not just to thank him, but to understand the mind behind that act. What kind of person possessed that level of knowledge and preferred the anonymity of a cafe counter? What past wounds had shaped him? Henry mobilized his resources, which for a man of his position meant a quick and efficient search. He discovered the simple neighborhood where Eli lived, the modest life he led. But what caught his attention most was a detail in the young man's brief employment history, a small artisanal cosmetics company that had gone bankrupt years earlier. The missing piece of the puzzle began to fit. The search led him, days later, to a place he hadn't frequented for decades, a public library in South London. And there he was, sitting at a back table, surrounded by piles of books on tax law, finance, and corporate governance. Notebooks filled with notes covered the table, and his eyes, though tired, shone with an intensity Henry rarely saw, even in his most ambitious executives. Eli wasn't celebrating his feat. He wasn't seeking a new opportunity. He was simply continuing his journey, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, as if the episode at the cafe had been just another lesson learned. Henry approached in silence and stopped before the table. Eli looked up, and for a moment there was no surprise on his face, just a silent recognition. "I looked for you," Henry said, his voice softer than usual. "You disappeared." Eli closed the book in front of him. "I did what I thought was right. I didn't need anything else." "What you did," Henry began, searching for the right words, "was more than right. You saved my company from a mistake that could have cost everything." "I don't understand why you left." "Because my place isn't there, Mr. Vance," Eli replied simply. "I don't belong in that world. I just saw a pattern I already knew." It was then that Henry understood the young man's depth. It wasn't arrogance nor false modesty. It was the humility of someone who learned from pain, who found strength in his own vulnerability. He saw that Eli's knowledge didn't come from expensive diplomas hanging on the wall, but from raw experience, from the need to understand, to survive. "I disagree," Henry said, the decision forming in his mind. "I think your place is exactly where people like you are most needed, where integrity and real knowledge are worth more than appearances." He extended his hand, not as a powerful CEO, but as a man who recognized a rare talent. "I'm not offering a reward, Eli. I'm offering an opportunity, a temporary position in my company. As a consultant, your sole function would be to read contracts and look for what no one else sees. The hidden risks, the traps." Eli hesitated. The offer was tempting, but the specter of the corporate world, the same one that had crushed him before, frightened him. He feared being turned into a trophy, a marketing piece for the company. "I don't want to be a symbol," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I just want to keep studying." Henry nodded, understanding his apprehension. "I guarantee it. You'll have your own office, your books, your time. No fanfare, no announcements. Just your work. You'll be able to maintain your study routine without any interference. Think of it as an extension of your library, but with a real impact." The proposal was unusual but sincere. Eli pondered, the conflict visible on his face. It was a chance to apply everything he had learned, to make a difference on a scale he had never imagined. But it was also the risk of exposing himself again, of entering the arena that had hurt him so much. After a long silence, he finally looked up and gave his answer. An answer that would change not only his life, but also the destiny of Vance Enterprises and everyone around him in ways none of them could foresee. What he didn't know was that the story that began with a coffee and a contract was far from over. The gears of destiny were already in motion, propelled by the journalist who had witnessed everything. And a media storm was brewing on the horizon, ready to test Eli's courage and Henry's conviction in a brutal and unexpected way. The silence Eli so cherished was about to be broken forever. Eli's acceptance was a murmur, not a declaration. He nodded, and in that silent gesture a pact was sealed. True to his word, Henry orchestrated Eli's arrival at Vance Enterprises with the discretion of a state secret. There was no company-wide welcome email, no formal introductory meeting, no forced handshakes in the coffee room. On a Monday morning, Eli simply appeared, was led by Henry's personal assistant to a small room at the back of the legal department, and left alone with a pile of documents and a computer. The room was a glass fishbowl, a modest office that brutally contrasted with the opulence of the directors' offices, with their panoramic city views. But for Eli it was a sanctuary. It had a desk, a comfortable chair, and most importantly, silence. His routine settled into a monastic discipline. He arrived before most employees, brewed his own coffee in the kitchenette, and locked himself in his office. He read contracts with a concentration that seemed oblivious to the outside world. His lunches were brief, often at his desk as his eyes scanned clauses and addendums. At the end of the day, he organized his notes into concise and objective reports, which were sent directly to Henry's email. And then he left for his true passion, the library, where he continued his studies late into the night. The presence of that stranger in the nest soon generated whispers in the corridors. Who was this young man who spoke to no one, who didn't attend meetings, and yet reported directly to the CEO? The theories were many, ranging from a distant relative of Henry to a secret auditor hired for a future mass layoff. The legal team, in particular, viewed him with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. They were experienced professionals, with degrees from the best universities, and they couldn't understand what this young man with no apparent resume could contribute. Initially, Eli's reports were seen as the work of a pretentious amateur. He pointed out risks in contracts that had already been approved by the entire team, in deals that were already underway. His notes were about nuances, about the interaction of clauses that in isolation seemed harmless, but which together created dangerous loopholes. He highlighted the lack of clarity in definitions, the potential for double interpretation in technical terms, the absence of protection mechanisms against unforeseen market events. The first time one of his reports proved its worth, it was almost by chance. A supply contract with a technology company, considered routine and low risk, was about to be renewed. Eli, in his report, flagged a small alteration in the intellectual property clause. The change, disguised amidst technical jargon, gave the supplier rights over any innovations jointly developed, during the term of the contract. The legal team had let it pass, considering it irrelevant. Henry, however, trusting his new consultant, requested a more in-depth analysis. It turned out that the supplier was about to be acquired by a direct competitor of Vance Enterprises. The clause, if signed as it was, would hand over a valuable research and development asset on a silver platter to the competition. The contract was hastily renegotiated, and the company saved itself from a £1 million strategic trap. The episode was not publicized, but the news spread internally. The whispers about Eli began to change tone. Disdain gave way to reluctant respect, and curiosity turned into astonishment. The CEO's boy began to be seen as a kind of silent oracle, whose objective and unembellished reports became mandatory reading before any important signing. Eli, oblivious to this change in perception, continued his work. For him, it wasn't a competition. It was the practical application of everything he had studied, the validation of his sleepless nights. He found an unexpected peace in that routine, a purpose that went beyond merely surviving. He was protecting the company, just as no one had protected him in the past. The relationship with Henry also evolved, in silence and at a distance. There were no long conversations or meetings. Communication occurred through Eli's reports and Henry's brief confirmation notes. It was a partnership based on trust and results, a mutual understanding that needed no words. Henry, in turn, felt a growing admiration for that young man. In a world where everyone clamored for attention and recognition, Eli's discretion was disconcerting and profoundly respectable. He saw in Eli the personification of a value that he himself, in his relentless ascent to the top, had perhaps forgotten: the power of humility and the pursuit of knowledge for knowledge's sake. This calm, however, was merely the eye of the storm. In a newsroom on the other side of the city, the journalist who had been at the Aurora Cafe finally found the perfect hook for his story. After weeks of investigating Eli's past life and his sudden hiring by Vance Enterprises, he wove a narrative that mixed facts with venomous insinuations. And then on a Thursday morning, the bomb exploded. The business blog published the article with a banner, sensationalist headline, "The cashier who charmed the CEO, the secret story behind the lightning hiring at Vance Enterprises." The text was a masterpiece of distortion. It painted Eli as a cunning opportunist who had orchestrated a situation to impress the billionaire Henry Vance. It insinuated that the discovery of the contract flaw was nothing more than a stroke of luck, or worse, a staged act. It described the hiring not as a recognition of merit, but as an act of personal favoritism, a whim of a bored CEO. The article explored Eli's humble past, not to extol his overcoming, but to highlight how improbable and therefore suspicious his rise was. The story was irresistible. The narrative of the poor young man who, with a single masterstroke, wins the trust of a magnate, was a feast for the public's imagination. Within hours, the link to the article spread like wildfire across social media. Eli Foster's name was everywhere, accompanied by memes, conspiracy theories, and hasty judgments. The impact on Vance Enterprises was immediate and brutal. The communication department's phones wouldn't stop ringing. Reporters camped outside the building, trying to extract a statement from any employee entering or leaving. The internal atmosphere, previously one of reluctant respect for Eli, soured instantly. The whispers returned, now laden with malice and envy. He was the darling, the protégé, the one who didn't have to climb the corporate ladder like everyone else. The company's credibility, built over decades, began to be tarnished. Shareholders called, concerned. Business partners questioned the stability of Henry's leadership. The financial market, averse to any sign of instability or scandal, reacted nervously. For Eli, the world collapsed. He saw the article in the morning on his phone, while having coffee before going to work. Every word was like a punch to the gut. His story, his pain, his silent struggle, everything had been scrutinized, twisted, and exposed in a cruel and humiliating way. He who had always shunned the spotlight, who found safety in anonymity, was now the center of a media circus. Shame consumed him. He didn't feel anger towards the journalist, but a deep and paralyzing guilt. In his mind, he was responsible for all that chaos. His decision to intervene in the cafe, his acceptance of the job. He had brought turmoil into Henry's life, into the company that had welcomed him. He felt like an imposter, exactly as the article painted him. That day he didn't go to the office. He stayed home locked in with his phone turned off, while the world outside debated and judged his life. He saw the headlines multiplying, each more sensationalist than the last. He saw his face plastered on websites he never imagined accessing. He felt the stares of his neighbors, the subtle change in how they greeted him in the building's hallway. He felt naked, exposed, and most of all, a burden. That night the decision matured in his mind, painful but necessary. He couldn't allow his presence to continue damaging the reputation of Vance Enterprises and Henry. The man who had given him a chance didn't deserve to have his integrity questioned because of him. He needed to disappear again, this time forever. He sat at his small table in the room, the same one where he had studied so many nights, and took out a sheet of paper. With a trembling hand, he began to write. It wasn't a letter of anger or resentment. It was an apology. He thanked him for the opportunity, the trust, and deeply regretted the negative publicity his story had caused. He explained that his intention had never been to seek notoriety, and that to protect the company, his only option was to step away. Every word was written with the weight of resignation. Upon finishing, he carefully folded the paper and placed it in an envelope. The act of sealing it was like closing a chapter of his life, a chapter that, for a brief moment, had given him hope. The next day he got up, dressed with the same discretion as always, and left. He didn't go to his office at the back of the legal department. With the envelope in hand, which seemed to weigh a ton, he walked through the corridors of Vance Enterprises, ignoring the curious glances and whispers that ceased as he passed. His destination was one, the president's office. He was going to hand his resignation directly to Henry Vance, the man he felt he had betrayed with his very existence. He knocked on the massive wooden door, the sound echoing in his racing heart, prepared to say goodbye. The door opened before the echo of the knock had even dissipated. Henry Vance stood beside his immense rosewood desk, phone to his ear. His expression was stern, forged in years of corporate battles. Upon seeing Eli, he abruptly ended the call. "Come in," he said, his voice a contained thunder. It wasn't an invitation, it was an order. Eli entered, the white envelope in his hand looking like a strange and fragile object in that environment of power. He felt the weight of Henry's gaze, a gaze that seemed to scrutinize his soul, searching for cracks. "I imagine you didn't come to discuss the latest report," Henry said with a touch of bitter irony. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. Eli remained standing. "No, sir," he said, his voice firm despite the internal turmoil. "I came to deliver this." He held out the envelope. Henry ignored it, his eyes fixed on the young man's face. "I don't need to read it to know what it is, and the answer is no." "Mr. Vance, please," Eli insisted, stepping forward and placing the envelope on the polished desk. "I cannot allow my presence to cause further damage to the company's reputation. The article, the rumors, all of this is because of me. I am truly sorry, more than I can express in words. I didn't want to harm you or the company." Henry slowly walked around the desk, stopping inches from Eli. He was taller, and his physical presence was intimidating, but his gaze at that moment was not of anger, but of deep and cutting disappointment. "Harm the company?" he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you think the company is harmed when we defend the truth? Do you think my reputation is built on the fragile foundation of a sensationalist blogger's opinion? You underestimate me, Eli, and what's worse, you underestimate yourself." He picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Instead, he tore it into 2 pieces, and then into 4, letting the fragments fall to the floor like funeral confetti. "I didn't accept your resignation from the cafe, and I certainly won't accept it now. Cowardice is not a value we cultivate at Vance Enterprises, and running from a fight is the definition of cowardice." Eli was speechless. Henry's gesture completely disarmed him. He expected anger, perhaps even relief, but not that fierce defense, that unwavering refusal. "But what are you going to do?" Eli stammered. "The story is everywhere. They're calling me a fraud, and you—" "I know what they're saying," Henry interrupted. "And now they're going to hear what I have to say." He turned and pressed a button on his intercom. "Marcella, cancel all my meetings for the rest of the day, and call a press conference for 2 o'clock this afternoon, here in the main auditorium. Call all the important outlets. Yes, all of them. The topic is the integrity of Vance Enterprises." He hung up and turned back to Eli, whose eyes were wide with panic. "A press conference?" "Sir, don't do that. That will only add fuel to the fire. They'll distort everything you say. Please, the best thing to do is let the dust settle. The dust doesn't settle when lies are in the air, Eli. It turns into mud, Henry said with steely conviction. And I won't let mud stain the name of this company nor yours. You did the right thing. Now it's my turn to do the same. From that moment on, the headquarters of Vance Enterprises transformed into a war operations center. The communications team went into crisis mode. Phones rang incessantly. Assistants rushed through the corridors. Eli was led to a small waiting room, where he remained isolated from the chaos, feeling like a prisoner at the center of the hurricane he himself had created. He watched through the glass window the frantic movement, the setup of camera and lighting equipment in the auditorium. Every flash of light, every cable being stretched across the floor increased his despair. Henry was risking everything, putting his credibility on the line for him. The weight of that loyalty was overwhelming. Punctually at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Henry Vance walked to the podium set up on the auditorium stage. The place was packed with journalists, photographers, and videographers. The hum of conversations and the incessant clicking of cameras created an atmosphere reminiscent of a Roman arena. Eli watched everything from a monitor in his small room, his heart pounding against his ribs. Henry waited for silence to settle. He carried no papers. There was no prepared speech. His eyes swept across the audience, cold and determined. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice resonating with authority. "I called you here today to correct a narrative, a false and irresponsible narrative that has been published about this company and about one of its newest and most valuable collaborators." He paused, letting the tension build. "In recent days, you have read a fantastical story about a cashier who charmed a CEO. A story that insinuates favoritism and questions the integrity of our decisions. Today, I am here to tell you the real story." And then, with a clarity and precision that silenced the auditorium, Henry narrated the events of that morning at the Aurora Cafe. He omitted nothing. He described the billion-pound deal he was about to sign, the importance of the transaction for the company's future. He described Eli's arrival, his discreet intervention, his precise question. The young man who until that moment was a complete stranger to me heard 3 phrases from a complex negotiation and identified a dangerous pattern, Henry continued, his voice gaining intensity. A pattern that our experienced lawyers and consultants had missed. He alerted us to a clause, a single clause, that had been subtly altered from the digital version, an alteration that seemed harmless, but which concealed a legal trap. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. The journalists, previously eager for a scandal, now listened attentively, their pens racing across their notepads. "This clause," Henry said, tapping lightly on the podium for emphasis, "would have covertly transferred all major operational risks of the business to Vance Enterprises from the 3rd year onwards. It would have exposed us to an irrecoverable loss, potentially jeopardizing the company's financial health and our shareholders' investments. Eli Foster, with his observation and his knowledge, saved this company from disaster." He looked directly at the cameras. "And what did he do afterward? Did he ask for a reward? A promotion? No, he disappeared. He resigned the next day, wanting nothing in return. I sought him out, I found him, and I convinced him to bring his talent here, not as a favor, but because competence and integrity are the most valuable assets this company can have, no matter where they come from. The published article is not just a lie, it's an insult," Henry concluded, his voice laden with contained indignation. "It's an insult to a brilliant young man who transformed personal hardship into profound knowledge. It's an insult to all who believe that merit can be found in the most unexpected places. Eli Foster is not an opportunist. He is an example, and Vance Enterprises is proud and fortunate to have him with us. Any questions?" The impact was seismic. The few questions that followed were weak attempts to maintain the scandal narrative, but Henry disarmed them with facts and unwavering sincerity. In less than 20 minutes, the press conference was over. But the story was just beginning. In the room where he watched, Eli was paralyzed, silent tears streaming down his face. Never in his life had he felt so seen, so understood, so defended. Henry had not only saved him, he had restored the dignity that life, and more recently the media, had stolen from him. The effect of Henry's speech was immediate and overwhelming. Even before the reporting teams left the building, the video of the press conference was already online. The hashtag We're All Eli began to emerge on social media. The narrative turned 180 degrees. The same people who had ridiculed him now celebrated him. News websites that had emblazoned the sensationalist headline now published retractions and praised Henry's stance. The video went viral, reaching millions of views in a few hours. The story ceased to be about a corporate scandal and became an inspiring tale of merit, integrity, and leadership. Eli was no longer the opportunistic cashier. He was the self-taught genius, the anonymous hero of Canary Wharf. The storm had passed, and in its place an unexpected sun shone. Later that day, the door to Eli's office opened. It was Henry. He said nothing about the press conference. He just looked at the young man, who was now sitting at his desk, and said with a simplicity that carried the weight of everything that had happened, "Your work is waiting for you. We have a contract with a Canadian pension fund that needs a keen eye." Eli nodded, unable to formulate a complete sentence. A thank you seemed too small for the immensity of his gratitude. Henry understood. He gave a slight nod and left, closing the door behind him. Alone again in his glass sanctuary, Eli looked at the pile of documents in front of him. For the first time, he didn't feel like a stranger, an intruder. He felt he belonged there. Fear and shame had dissipated, replaced by a new and fragile confidence. He opened the first page of the contract and began to read, no longer as someone hiding from the world, but as someone who finally understood his worth in it. The relationship between him and Henry, forged in the fire of crisis, had transformed. It was no longer boss and employee. It was something deeper, a bond of mutual respect and silent admiration that would continue to grow, shaping the future of both and the company in ways the media spotlight could never capture. In time, the spotlights faded, and the dust of the media storm settled. The story of Eli and Henry, which had been eagerly consumed by the public, gradually gave way to new scandals and new inspirations. And it was precisely in that silence, away from curious glances, that the true transformation took place. The dynamic at Vance Enterprises changed subtly but profoundly. Eli never lost his reserved nature, but his presence was no longer an anomaly. His glass office, once seen as the protégé's ivory tower, became a silent pilgrimage point for the company's lawyers and analysts. Before finalizing an opinion or approving a complex clause, it was common to see a senior manager standing at his door, not to give orders but to ask for an opinion, with a respect that would have been unthinkable before. "Eli, could you take a look at this? I feel like something is escaping me." And Eli, with his infinite patience, read, analyzed, and almost always found what no one else saw. He never flaunted his knowledge. His contributions were always presented as suggestions, never as corrections, which preserved the dignity of his colleagues and at the same time strengthened the security of the company's contracts. The reports became more precise, the clauses more transparent. The Eli factor, as some began to call it behind the scenes, became synonymous with security and meticulousness. He never sought prominence, but he became silently indispensable. The relationship between him and Henry also deepened at its own cadence, far from corporate rituals of public praise or career promises. Their communication consisted of brief conversations at the end of the day, the exchange of a book with margin notes, a look of understanding during a tense meeting. Henry, a man accustomed to a competitive and at times dehumanizing environment, found in Eli a perspective that money couldn't buy. He began to see the business world not just as a battlefield of numbers and strategies, but as an ecosystem of human decisions, where vulnerability and integrity held real weight. He came to realize that true intelligence didn't always come with framed diplomas and influential surnames. Often, it was hidden in the quietness of those who learned from their own scars. For Henry, the greatest lesson was about leadership. He understood that being a leader wasn't just about having the answers, but about having the humility to listen to those who possess them, regardless of rank or origin. Eli, still with his feet firmly on the ground, began to accept what had once seemed impossible to him. His knowledge, even forged in solitude and failure, had immense value. Henry's trust gave him the validation no educational institution could offer. He came to understand that his journey wasn't a story of overcoming to be sold in headlines, but proof that knowledge, when sought with purpose, is the most powerful of tools. On a rainy winter night, almost a year after the press conference, The two were alone in Henry's office, reviewing the final details of a complex merger. The work was done, and a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of rain against the window pane. Henry poured himself a coffee and extended a cup to Eli. "You know, Eli," he began, his voice thoughtful, "I never truly asked you. That day at the Aurora Cafe, why? I know you saw a flaw in the contract. I know you did what was right. But there was something more. I saw it in your eyes. It wasn't just the concern of a good Samaritan. It was personal." Eli held the warm cup between his hands, the heat spreading through his fingers. He looked at the city lights blurred by the rain and, for the first time, felt ready to share the most painful chapter of his story. "It was personal," he confirmed, his voice low. "Those clauses, I didn't recognize them from a book or a class. I recognized them from my own life." He then told Henry the story of his small candle and cosmetics company. He spoke of the passion, the dreams, the hard work. And he spoke of the investor, a charming and persuasive man who promised him the world. He described the signing of the contract, his naivety, the way the same semantic traps he had identified in Vance Enterprises' contract were used to drain his company, leave him in debt and destroy his dream. When I finally understood that I had lost everything, that the contract I signed was my own sentence, I confronted him, Eli continued, his eyes fixed on a distant point in the past. I was broken, humiliated. I yelled, asked how he could have done that, and he just laughed. A smile I will never forget. Eli paused, taking a deep breath before revealing the core of the matter. He placed a hand on my shoulder and said, with a paternal and cruel tone, "Don't worry, kid. Consider this your tuition for the school of life. It was an expensive business lesson, I know, but I'll give you a piece of advice for free." Then he leaned in and whispered the 4 words that changed my life into my ear. Henry waited. The silence in the room was dense, laden with the weight of the revelation to come. "He said," Eli continued, his voice choked with memory, but firm with the resolve it had given him, "I'll teach you something." He said it with contempt, as if I were an idiot who needed to be taught. "I'll teach you something about how the world really works." And he did. That day, amidst the wreckage of my dream, I made a promise to myself. I would learn that lesson. I would study it, dissect it, master it until the poison became the antidote. I swore that one day I would use that knowledge, not to deceive or destroy, but to protect someone, so that no one else would have to hear those words with the same contempt I heard. Henry remained silent for a long time, processing the depth of what he had just heard. Eli's story wasn't just about a contract. It was about the transmutation of pain into power, of humiliation into wisdom. The warning at the cafe hadn't been a random act of genius, but the fulfillment of a silent promise, the climax of a solitary journey of redemption. "So that day," Henry said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion, "when you approached my table, I didn't see a billionaire CEO," Eli completed. "I saw myself years ago, and I heard his voice. And I knew I couldn't stay silent. I had to rewrite the end of that lesson. At that moment, the bond between them became unbreakable. It was no longer about gratitude or admiration, but about a deep understanding of each other's journey. While the spotlights faded outside, their story remained alive where it mattered most. In the company's day-to-day decisions, in the culture of integrity, they began to build together. None of it had started with grand gestures or ambitious goals. It began with a simple warning, coming from someone who technically was nobody there. A whispered warning between coffee cups and loose contract pages. A warning that began with 4 words, spoken with cruelty, but re-signified by determination. And that, in the end, taught everyone an unforgettable lesson about the true worth of a human being. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eli and Henry has moved you. Stories of overcoming and integrity remind us of the strength that exists in the most unexpected places. To follow this emotional journey, we have prepared a special playlist with equally captivating narratives about life-changing encounters. Find it here on our channel. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, leave a like, and tell us in the comments what lesson it left for you. Every day we bring unique stories that explore the complexity of life. Don't miss our next content. We look forward to seeing you